Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I read a module and then talk about it for however long I see fit. Very interesting one today, for a lot of reasons. Now, what we are going to look at today is the 100th edition of Dragon. Now, naturally, if you've seen some other videos of this series, you might be wondering, why are we talking about Dragon? Because I already did this. I spoke about I believe it was the third volume of the Dragon, basically, anthology, which was some of the best articles ever published in Dragon, and I got to nerd out about how important Dragon was for the history of the game, how things developed within Dragon, yada yada yada. That's one of my favorite Module Monday videos if you want to go and check that out. But why talk about this one when I found number 100 sort of in my collection? Also, I should just point out before I move on, if the video looks a little different, I'm trying something a little different with this video and another one. I'm actually recording it at a bit of a different time than I normally would, because usually I record very early in the morning, and it's almost a little too bright with how the lighting in my room works, so I'm doing it a little later in the day to see if I maybe wouldn't then have to do so much white balance and color grading. So if you're watching the video and you think it looks a little different in this video and potentially the next one, that's why. But why talk about number 100? So reading through this kind of struck a chord with me for one really particular reason. So the backstory behind this edition of Dragon, number 100, is that it was really meant to be just a giant love letter to the fans. In that it was specifically crafted to basically be a celebration with regard to the fact that it was the 100th edition. Now, how did they do that? Well, they basically made an edition of Dragon as usual, and it has everything in here, the type of stuff we didn't see when we looked through the anthology. It has all sorts of advertisements, many of which are outside of the realm of Dungeons & Dragons itself, because Dragon really was more just a tabletop/fantasy magazine. That's even shown here. Iron Crown, this is stuff about Lord of the Rings. There's actually something much further on, if I can find it. I know there's something in here about actually Lord of the Rings figures, if I'm not mistaken. Where is it? I read through this initially like a week ago. I know it's in here. Come on. I know it's in here somewhere. There's something about figurines. Here we go. Here's someone's music album that they were, fantasy music album that they were apparently making. Mr. Ramal Lamar. It's odd. Yeah, so they're not Lord of the Rings characters, but they're these figures here. But there's also a whole bunch of things about other games. Obviously, there were more than a few D&D advertisements, because this is what Dragon was. It was a more fantasy magazine as opposed to something that was strictly Dungeons and Dragons, which made it great, because if you were a fantasy nerd, you were able to learn about new things through these advertisements and whatnot. Advertisement, of course, for Gen Con. It's obligatory. You had to. This was back in the day that anytime you wanted to purchase anything you saw in any of these advertisements, you had to mail it in. There's a whole section in here about Marvel characters, because there was a time where there was a real serious push to sort of make a superhero variant of D&D. It never really went anywhere, mainly because crafting superheroes and creating rule sets for superheroes is very difficult, as people learned. But the reason specifically I want to talk about this, so, it has a bunch of cool things. It's your typical edition of Dragon with everything that you could want, both as far as the articles and even the advertisements. I really like this advertisement for White Dwarf. Kind of cool. But the reason I wanted to talk about this after I read through it was in the way that this was a love letter to the fans. and the unfortunate realization that something like this will never be done again. What do I mean by that? If you weren't aware, or if you follow D&D and tabletop gaming, Wizards of the Coast basically, and I'm not going to go super into detail about it because there are people that have, and great articles that have been written that explain it much more succinctly than I could ever hope to. Wizards of the Coast basically came out and were trying to make some pretty heavy changes to the gaming license, the open gaming license, which is what people publish their own adventures under, if you weren't aware. That would basically let them scalp off the top to make more money for themselves. It caused a really massive uproar, as it should have. It was a screw you to the fans, a pretty massive one. And there was never really anything done other than they eventually sort of backed off to make it up to the fans. And it was in reading this 100th edition, celebration as it is, that the reality that Wizards of the Coast would never do something like this, something that is so specifically for the fans, became really evident and really saddening. So what did TSR, who were the makers of Dragon, actually do as a means to sort of make this for the fans? Well, you know, they put together an edition of Dragon that features, as writers and contributors, just to name a few people, multiple articles from Gary Gygax, an article from Ed Greenwood, an article from Douglas Niles, who got mentioned in a previous, in the last episode about Against the Cult of the Reptile God, Frank Mentzer, who was a buddy of Gygax, a close collaborator. It features art from Larry Elmore. It has a full-fledged, complete module within it. And as well as, there's one thing I'm forgetting. Oh, what am I forgetting? One other thing. There was one other thing that I was really impressed with that they did. Ooh, if I think of it, I'll bring it up. But, yeah. So, when they said we need to make a magazine edition for the fans, well, they just went and got some of the biggest names that were attached to tabletop and fantasy gaming at the time and got them all together to contribute to one piece, and then also gave you a full-fledged module for free for $4, which, granted, $4 a little different in 85, as I believe this was, August of 85, if I'm not mistaken. Please tell me. It was either 85 or 86. 85, we got it right. Let's go. August of 85. Oh, it was this. The other thing I want to bring up was this piece of artwork here, which this was actually like a sculpture that they basically did a whole. They talk about it in here, like the painstaking effort that they basically had to go through to light this properly to make it look good, and it is a really, I think, a very, very cool piece of artwork between the dragon and the sort of short sword dagger thing that's behind him. It looks great. So all the things that they went through to make this, again, for the fans. There is also anything you could hope for to find in an article in an edition of Dragon. It starts with the detailing of a new type of battle game, which was basically like a style of fencing in real life. Then you have some class changes to the druid and the ranger. Not changes, but what happened was they basically at one point made it so that you could play as a druid / ranger multiclass, so they had to specify some things based on alignment because of that. Yeah, obviously, again, I went over some of the advertisements. You have here from Ed Greenwood some spell tomes some new spells and whatnot. You even get some fiction from Gary Gygax, which is not really what anyone wants from Gary Gygax. We're going to talk about that more in my next episode, but you get some fiction, so you've got rule changes, you've got rule supplement, you've got content and spell supplements, you've got some fiction. This story was okay. I love this imagery right here. This Unearthed Arcana imagery. Look at that beauty. Look at that. Oh, it's so good. Gygax goes on to detail a new way to play what he calls dragon chess, which is basically just 3D chess. Although it's much more intricate as far as the pieces and how they move and everything else. What else is there in here? So this is the full-fledged module, the City Beyond the Gate. This is kind of a neat module. I don't know if it's one that I would... Oh, they also give you the addition to buy back orders of Dragon if you missed any articles, any issues that you wanted. This is the module, which is actually sees you basically get transported through a portal to London, England, to find the Mace of St. Cuthbert. Pretty cool. It's more of a novelty because it's very much based around like you're there in your wizard clothes and you now have to walk around England. You know, people are gonna be looking at you funny. So it's kind of based around that whole premise, but it's sincerely a well thought out, well written module. Probably one that's a bit difficult to actually implement into a long running game, but you do get to go around to areas of London. They, literally detail various, not only how spells and whatnot work, considering you're in now a modern world, but they detail several, like here's a map of London, several places, Buckingham Road and whatnot. They do detail places like the Palace, although they tell you probably should not go there. But it's very neat. Like I said, it's a little bit of a novelty sort of style of module, but it was fun. I think it would be fun if you could work it into a world, just because it's such a complete change of pace. My favorite thing you can see here, Buckingham Palace. Don't even think about letting PCs in here. So yeah, there's that. Probably smart. Drop it in on the Queen. But, so you have, again, rule supplementation, rule changes, fiction, a full-fledged module, an entire section about what was then the upcoming edition of Marvel superhero tabletop games. This is another great advertisement. So you have all these for the Marvel stuff. Then you get, at the end here, as you finish up, the new battle system stuff, which became really big later on with, like, Dark Sun. But battle system, this is a full detailing of how the battle system works, which lets you have really large-scale combats. This was obviously them sort of selling it. Make sure you can see that. Them sort of selling it there. Here, there are Lord of the Rings miniatures. I found them. It only took me 15 minutes. There are Lord of the Rings miniatures. See, I'm not going insane. Although I am insane. I was a page off. Okay, fine. Yeah, they answer fan questions. Talk about the creation of this edition and various... This is about the battle system. Just everything literally you could ever want for $4 in an edition of Dragon. And what I think is amazing about this is that this shows that TSR, if there was anything they really understood back in the day, was that the fans and the communities are the ones that make tabletop gaming. I think it could very reasonably be argued, not to get on a soapbox, that from a fundamental standpoint, TSR does not understand that. TSR sees D&D as an avenue to make money, and anything they believe they have to do to make more of it is what they're going to do. The efforts and interests of the fans be damned. They have lost sight of the fact that whatever they create is then taken and made ultimately better by the fans. Because that is the ideal for any module or rule book or monster manual, is the idea that you grant a starting point and then your fans take it and run with it. That is what makes tabletop games great, and it is through, there's a plane flying overhead, I apologize, it is through this, the effort that went into providing anything and everything that a fan could want in this 100th edition, that TSR showed they understood that. They said, we need to do something for the people that make this all popular, that let us sell books and let us have success. Like I said, that is lost, I think, nowadays in the modern tabletop gaming space. And I don't think it's ever coming back. I don't think Wizards of the Coast ever has any sort of interest of becoming a fan-centric entity at this point. They sort of showed their colors. And mind you, being fan-centric does not mean not making money. Because I think that's what Wizards of the Coast would say. If you were to show, they would say, well, how are we supposed to hit their bottom line? I don't know, by doing exactly this. Because last I checked, you still had to pay $4 for this edition of the magazine. And they still got all their advertising space. Right? No fan is reasonably saying that Wizards of the Coast should not be making money off Dungeons & Dragons. When they are so... in a lot of ways, it seems like they're blatantly anti-fan. In the way that, again, they wanted to change the open gaming license to reach into pockets instead of celebrating what people do, in the way that the efforts of independent creators and fans of the game, how that grows Dungeons & Dragons and in turn makes Wizards of the Coast more money. They just seem to be completely unaware of that and didn't care. And you see the difference in what tabletop games were and how they cared about the fans and how they knew that the fans were the ones making all of this possible. In comparison today. Like I said, I don't think any reasonable person is saying that Wizards of the Coast or TSR back when they ran all this shouldn't be making their money. But maybe, don't send Pinkerton agents to someone's house when they wind up with some magic cards that they're not supposed to have at that point. Maybe don't do that. You can make your money. We'll buy the things. We want to buy the things. We want to support the things that bring us joy and happiness, and that's what tabletop games do. But maybe don't then shove a broomstick up our ass and break it off. It's gross. And I'm not saying TSR was a perfect company. TSR had a lot of issues. One of the biggest issues with TSR was that they constantly had supply issues. I brought it up in my not musings or not module Monday, but in musings of the idiots when I talk about musings of an idiot when I talked about Keep on the Borderlands. The basic set that my father got came with chits because they ran out of dice. Like, TSR was not a phenomenally run company. They had their issues, but they understood that it was the fans that kept them afloat. And they made sure to show that here by giving the fans everything they could have wanted. And Dragon itself really did that in the way that it allowed fans to have their questions answered and changes be made to the game. I think really if we want to see a world in which tabletop games can continue to grow, and listen, they're in a boom right now, I get it. We're still in a sort of online live streaming Critical Role generated boom. I get it, and I love that. But I think the fact that something like Critical Role decidedly feels like it's more for the fans than the parent company making these games and these modules is just ridiculous. And like I said, no one's saying you have to give away everything for free. No one's saying you can't make changes to rule sets or how things are distributed. That's the job of Wizards of the Coast. That's their job as the business proprietor, to figure out how these things are best done so that materials and new games can continue to be made. But when you see something like this, again, this 100th edition that was so blatantly just basically a bunch of fan service in the way it's constructed and what's talked about and the people they got to be involved, in comparison to you fast forward 35 odd years, and the parent company is doing everything they can to reach into the pockets of the people that proliferate their game. It's depressing. And I didn't mean for this to be a sort of sad episode, but I want to end on this sort of, if we're ever going to get back to a point where tabletop games really truly become something for the fans, then there needs to be a conscious, concerted effort by those, whether it's Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, the official institutions like D&D Beyond, to make it about the fans and give the fans every opportunity to have their own ideas come to life and support them in doing that, whether it's through the way things are released, the supplemental materials that are changes that are made. There needs to be we need to reopen the dialogue. Like I said, there's this section here, letters, is just all about answering people's questions. It needs to get back to being sort of grassroots. I think it's become a little monopolized, and it's too business focused. That doesn't mean, and like I said, I'm not arguing, I'm not screaming that Wizards of the Coast should be giving away everything for free, because they shouldn't. They need to get back to thinking about the fan, because I think being a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, having this, if I were a fan of D&D back in the 80s, and not alive, would make me so happy to be a fan of D&D. Would make me so happy, and I'm sure it would have made most other D&D fans so happy as well. And what's gone on, again, mostly over the past year from those in charge, and with certain changes that have been made with so little regard paid to the people that it will affect, is really, really depressing. I consider myself a forward-thinking person, but I really want to go back to these days, to these days where it felt like there was a dialogue, that TSR cared, and part of the process of turning Dungeons & Dragons into the greatest game in the world. And I think that's missing. And you can find that here in Dragon, that there was a real appreciation for the role that the fans play in that. I understand this episode was probably a little rambly. It was stunning when I really read through this, just to see how far we've fallen, because it is a fall at this point. I think changes need to be made. There really needs to be some sort of shakeup. I think the people with the loudest voices, again, I mentioned the Critical Roles, the people that are very closely attached to these companies now at this point, that are streaming on Twitch and whatnot, they got to take a stand for all the people they're supposedly providing entertainment for. And we as the fans have to make a push to try and bring this sort of effort back. And that means understanding, of course, that Wizards of the Coast has to make money and to continue to support where appropriate. But man, I wish we could go back to these days. And I hope we get back to these days at some point. Man, oh man. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.